looks like for the most part, everyone who wanted to get in right at 6 is in. So I am just going to kick us off here. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sam Schipani. I'm a features reporter at the Bangor Daily News. I'm really looking forward to speaking with our special guest, Chef Rob Dumas, tonight about all the ways you can utilize and store your summer harvest. If you're a frequent reader of my articles, you're probably quite familiar with the sage insight and knowledge of Chef Rob, who is a frequent source of mine. And for those of you in the audience tonight who are subscribers, thank you for your support. And welcome to all of you who may be joining us on our BDN Events Online meetups for the first time. Just my little spiel as a local journalist. If local journalism is important to you, please consider purchasing a subscription to the BDN. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for this event, Tourmaline sponsor, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. We'll be taking questions in the chat feature of the event. I hope everyone knows how to use the chat feature at this point in our Zoomiverse. But if you have a question at any point during Rob's presentation, please just drop it in the chat. I'll be keeping track of them, and I will be moderating the Q&A at the end of the event. Yeah, so with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Rob, and he is going to give us a presentation before we enter our Q&A session. Let's take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sam. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I have put together a PowerPoint that we'll use to kind of guide our conversation this evening. But I'll start out by saying thank you so much for taking the time to join. I'm so excited to get to share a little bit of my passion for what makes life here in Maine so special, you know, being able to grow and put up your own food and connect with the history of that and the culture behind that. It's really a beautiful thing. So as introduced, I'm Chef Rob Dumas. I'm a certified executive chef with the American Culinary Federation. That's what the little CEC is about. And I work at the University of Maine for the School of Food and Agriculture, where I run the Dr. Mathew Highlands Pilot Plant for food processing, which you can see in the picture here on the right. And so in that facility, I help with research on all sorts of different food products. And I also provide service to industry, to companies like Wyman's and Bristol Seafood and Maine Grains, developing new consumer packaged goods and giving assistance with product development and process refinement. So really a very cool job at UMaine, and I'm excited to say that the program is growing. So a little bit about my background. I grew up in Southern Louisiana. I was a military brat growing up, but it's kind of interesting, you know, to kind of look at that Acadian lineage and how some of my ancestors probably came to Maine before heading south to Louisiana and up into Arkansas. Louisiana was a wonderful place to grow up and really get immersed into a culture that's just crazy about food and crazy about celebrating food and getting together with others and enjoying food as a community and as a family. And it was really a great place to begin my journey into the world of food. When I left Louisiana, I actually joined the U.S. Navy, and I served on the USS Oklahoma City, which is a fast attack submarine. I was stationed on the East Coast in Virginia. And this is a picture of the submarine actually in Suda Bay in Crete. And if you see that little person right on the very back there, that's me. I was the ship's diver, and so I was kind of like a lifeguard when we did topside operations like that. But when I was on board the submarine, I also cooked. Cooking on a submarine was quite an experience. We fed quite a few people, and we had to work with a lot of preserved foods, kind of coincidentally, and along the same line of thinking as our conversation tonight. The submarine experience went well for me, and I got the opportunity to interview for a position to serve with President Obama at the White House in Washington, D.C. I moved to D.C. in 2009, and I served there until 2013. It was during my time in D.C. that I got involved with the American Culinary Federation and became certified. And that's also where I really became inspired to think about a smaller food system, think about local food, think about seasonal food. And I credit a lot of that shift in my thinking to Michelle Obama and her initiatives around the White House Garden, as well as Bill Yost, the pastry chef. Spent a lot of time talking with him about his relationships with folks like Dan Barber and Alice Waters, and gave me some great recommendations around some reading and ways to educate myself around where food could be going, if enough people make it a priority. When I left DC, I moved to Vermont and actually worked for the New England Culinary Institute in Montpelier, which was a great experience. It's where I really kind of refined and honed my culinary skills, and from a French classic cuisine setting, which coincidentally is very focused on local food and seasonal food, as well as wild foods, things like mushrooms and wild leeks and fiddleheads and things like that. Those are all celebrated parts of cuisine and culture in Europe, and something that is starting to get more notoriety and more presence here in America as well, which is very cool. So to bring it around to what we're here to talk about tonight, we're going to talk about some of the strategies to really make the most of your summer harvest here in Maine. So we're going to talk a little bit about some common approaches to food preservation. We're going to talk about canning, both water bath canning and pressure canning. We're going to talk about dehydration. We're going to talk about freezing. We're going to talk about fermenting. And lastly, we're going to talk about root cellaring. So, each one of these topics, honestly, is a full hour or more. Some of them we could talk about for days and never truly get to the bottom of them. So I will admit, this is going to be kind of a 10,000 foot view or mile high view kind of look at some of these. But the intent or the goal here is to inspire you maybe to try some new methods of preservation, or maybe even to inspire you to grow something that you haven't grown before with the intent of preserving it via one of these methods. I know that was certainly something with fermenting for me. I have a whole kimchi garden now, just so I can make some of these Korean cabbage ferments that I've really grown to enjoy eating. And so anyway, so that's the intent here. So let's dive right into our first topic. And our first topic is canning using a water bath canner. And I tried to keep a similar format through each topic here. So you'll see this basic breakdown for each of them, which hopefully gives you the opportunity maybe to reference back to this and think about what pros are important to you and what cons are important to you. So when canning with a water bath canner, some of the very notable pros to using that method of preservation is that your product is shelf stable. And what I mean by shelf stable is that it can be stored at room temperature. It doesn't require refrigeration. It doesn't require a freezer. It doesn't require a cellar. You can store these right in your pantry at home. They're quite easy to store. You can stack them. You can get you can build a wooden shelf or a metal Metro shelf, and you can put up quite a lot of food with a water bath canner. And I have to admit, a pantry full of home canned goods is absolutely beautiful to look at. There's some really gorgeous pictures going around on some of the social media sites of some of the veteran canners with all of their garden harvest stacked up neatly in a pantry, all water bath canned, and it's really beautiful. I will say though that there are some very real cons to water bath canning. It can be very dangerous if done incorrectly, and some recent research here at the University of Maine has uncovered that a lot of canning recipes that you can find these days on the internet haven't been adequately tested and don't achieve the appropriate safeguards for food safety. And I'll talk more about that as I get into some of the key points in the basic process a little further down. I will also say that using a water bath canner is quite a lot of work in the processing. There's quite a bit of sterilizing, there's quite a bit of prep, there's sometimes fairly long processing times, there's cooling. It's definitely the kind of work that you want to do as a family. Get your nieces and nephews, your children, your cousins, your aunts, your uncles, get a many hands make for light work. And canning is a wonderful way to connect with family and do that. But as a single person, or as a stay-at-home person, it can be a full day's work to put up some canned food. The other thing, and this is real here in Maine, some folks live in older homes, they don't have refrigeration. Running a water bath canner on your stove can be a very hot and steamy situation. Late August, early September, you can get some very hot days. Some people will use outside propane burners to do this, so they can get a little bit of relief from the heat that it creates. But when you get a large pot of water boiling on your stove for a long time, it really heats up the kitchen. Additionally, one of the other cons is for water bath canning, you're relying on vinegar and or sugar for food preservation. And then lastly, and this has been particularly pertinent this year, it necessitates the use of a new lid. So typically when you're using a water bath canner, you're going to be using a ball jar or a mason jar or a cur jar. The locking band you can reuse years after year after year. That's the screw-on part. But the actual lid has to be used new each time that you can. It has an adhesive on it that helps form a tight seal, and you can't reuse those. And I know, personally, when I first started canning, we would eat our pickles and then we would, wash the lids, put them back in the pantry, and then, next time we go to can something, we'd have to throw away all the old ones and get out the new ones. So my advice is, go ahead and just discard them when you're done using them. And if you do want to use a mason jar for some other sort of storage, you could save them for that, but they cannot be reused for canning. So let's talk a little bit about some of the key points for using a water bath canner. The number one most important point is to use an approved and tested recipe. There is a tendency to think, well, this is the way that my grandma did it, or this is the way that my great aunt Susan did it. But just because it worked out for them doesn't necessarily mean that it's a safe and tested recipe. Now, if you have a pH meter and you have a good understanding of how to process a sample and check your pH, you can test your own recipes. You can also send samples in for testing to the UMaine food testing lab. That's a requirement if you are intending to sell your home canned foods. But the easiest thing to do is to go to a reliable website, and I've listed some in the resources, but the Ball Book of Canning and Preserving and the National Center for Home Food Preservation from the University of Georgia are two wonderful resources where all of the recipes are tested and are safe to use. And the reason that pH is so important is it's the safeguard against foodborne illness. Canning creates an anaerobic environment, which is ideal for one of the most dangerous foodborne pathogens, Clostridium botulinum. You might have heard of botulism. It's a nerve agent. It can kill you. It's a very dangerous foodborne illness. And the really scary part about it is it has no smell and it has no visual cues. So when you don't have a pH of 4.6 or lower to prevent that CBOT, you have the chance that because it's the spores for CBOT are present in soil, they're present on the surface of fruits and vegetables, but they're not dangerous except in an anaerobic environment. And so when you use a canner and you subject that food product to that heated environment, it off gases all of the air in the can, and what you have now is a vacuum. And that vacuum, or that anaerobic, which means lack of oxygen environment, is what CBOT uses to reproduce and produce those toxic spores. So most canning recipes, or all canning recipes more or less that have been tested, will register a pH of 4.6 or lower. And I referenced a pH scale on here, and you'll see that 4.6 is on the acidic side of the scale, right? Because 7 is neutral, from 7 to 14 is alkaline, and from 0 to 7 is acidic. Acidity is often used as a safeguard for food. Now, if you do find an approved and tested recipe, but you want to make it your own, or you want to change it a little bit, that's a tendency that I have. I don't know if it's because I'm a chef by background and I always want to tinker and tool and have a hard time following direction, maybe. There are things that you can do with a recipe. You can adjust things like the spices that are used. You can adjust things like the type of chilies that are used, things like that. But what you can't do is you can't add additional vegetable ingredients, and you can't remove vegetable ingredients and still have it perform as expected by the folks that did the testing. So for example, I like spicy salsa. So I might add in, instead of some of the, bell peppers that the recipe calls for, I might add in some jalapenos, or I might even add in a can of chipotle chilies in the adobo sauce to make it a bit more spicy and smoky and kind of give it my own little bit of, different taste to it. One more note on key points with water bath canning. Weight-based recipes are best. And the reason that I say that is it's incredibly hard to measure whole round tomatoes in cups or in quarts, right? They're not all the same shape. They don't all pack into the volumetric measuring vessels the same. So definitely look at investing in an inexpensive kitchen scale and converting all of your recipes to weight. A fun experiment, if you're ever around a group of family, get out a 1 cup measure and everyone measure out 1 cup of flour and then weigh each person's cup of flour, and you'll see a dramatic difference in the weights from cup to cup. And when we're talking about something as important as achieving a pH to prevent botulism, following the recipe accurately is very important. So weight-based recipes are best. And that scale you'll find is useful for baking, for all kinds of cooking, and for your fermenting as well. Very useful to have a scale in the kitchen and to get comfortable using it. So the basic process for canning is you would prep your fruit or vegetables by washing, sometimes peeling, cutting. You'd sterilize your jars, warm up your new lids. Once your jars are sterilized, you'll pack them with your vegetable. Typically, you're using a vinegar solution, so you're heating up some vinegar, some water, spices, sugar, and then you're topping that vegetable packed jar with that vinegar solution. You want to take note that you're not getting a lot of that solution onto the lid of the jar, and if you do, you'll want to wipe it clean before placing your I guess not the lid, but the mouth of the jar. You'll want to wipe that clean before placing the lid on it. And you also need to be cognizant of what's called the headspace, and that's the airspace between the top of the vegetable and vinegar solution and the lid. Your recipe will have a specified headspace, and that's important to understand that. And most kits for canning will come with a headspace tool that has a graduated set of indents that can measure that for you. And then you'll process it in a water bath canner. And I do recommend investing in an actual water bath canner versus just using a large pot. I unfortunately have broken a few jars trying to do them in a large pot rather than in a water bath canner that has a rack in the bottom of it. But essentially you lower the jars into the canner, you process them for the specified amount of time, you remove them, and then you listen for the exciting little tink, 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 tink as all your cans as all your lids depress, because you have a good vacuum. So kind of fun. That's the basic process. A lot of people also use what's called the hot pack method. And this works for fruit jams, for things like tomato sauces. And so again, you process your fruit or vegetable by washing, peeling, or cutting. A lot of times you're cooking that to bring it to a boil or a simmer. You're then placing that into sterilized jars. You're then placing the lids on, inverting, and you'll be achieving a vacuum and a sealed jar from doing the hot pack method as well. And that's a little bit easier. You don't have to have the water bath canner, but not all recipes are designed or safe using the hot pack method. So you'll want to make sure that the resource that you're using for your recipe specifies that that's the appropriate method to use. Some older practices, which I would say are not tested and not safe, are using an oven for your thermal processing. Air is not as efficient at conducting heat energy as water is. So, even though it worked for, folks in the past, I'd say there's a safer way to do it now, and it behooves you to do so. The other thing that I will mention about water bath canning, because this is where we're talking about using a vinegar solution for canning, is quick pickling. Quick pickling is a fun, easy activity It's it's a nice way to put up maybe a small amount of a food product. Essentially, what you would do is you would take your vegetables, let's say red onions, for example. You would slice them up, you would put them into a jar, and then you would pour a boiling vinegar solution over those red onions. You'd allow it to cool, and then you would refrigerate it and enjoy them as a topping for tacos or for grilled meats or things like that. But the key difference there is that it's going to be refrigerated. Now, it still is in an acidic environment, so you will see a greatly extended shelf life, but you will have to keep it refrigerated for food safety reasons because it was not thermally processed. If you're a subscriber to Cooks Illustrated, their most recent issue had a 2-page spread on quick pickling, which was really well done and has some great recipes. But in the restaurant world, we've got big walk-in refrigerators. So typically when we're making, bread and butter pickles or things like that, we're making them in, 4-gallon Cambro containers, which is a big plastic container. And we are refrigerator pickling or quick pickling rather than going through the process of making a shelf-stable product. And so if you are blessed with a large refrigerator, please know that that's a great way to do it. It's also a fun way to try out a new recipe if you're, a little weary of what it might taste like and you don't want to use your full bushel of cucumbers. Can be a nice way to give the recipe a taste and see how you feel about it. So some of the food products that you might be harvesting from your Maine garden that lend themselves well to water bath canning, things like raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, grapes, all of those make wonderful jams and jellies. Those are some of the easiest things to process and some of the safest. Those berries already have an acidic nature. The combination of the sugar creates a very safe food product. Sugar ties up available water. So the water activity of a jam or jelly is quite low, yielding very little for bacteria to go on because you've got a high pH or an acidic pH and a low water activity. Jams and jellies are the safest place to start, in my opinion, for doing water bath canning. Some of the other classic things obviously are cucumbers, right? Making your sliced dills, making your pickle spears, pickle relish, those kind of things are classic. Dilly beans are another wonderful thing to put up this time of year as your green beans are coming out of the garden. My advice for dilly beans is pick them young. Don't let them go so long that they develop seeds or become tough. Pick young and pick often for good dilly beans. Peppers are wonderful pickled. You can make your own home canned jalapenos. You could also do things like pepperoncinis or banana peppers, things like that. Have seen quite a lot of recipes lately for zucchini relishes, green tomato relishes, tomato sauce, tomato chutneys, things like that. Peaches, plums, carrots, beets, pretty much all the root vegetables can be enjoyable pickled. But just keep in mind that it is an acidic food product. So sometimes, when you're sitting down to, a protein and a starch, you might not want to have a pile of pickled vegetables as your side, or you might love that kind of thing. I found growing up in the South, there was often a pickled vegetable option on the table at most family style meals, but there would also be a fresh prepared vegetable or salad as well. So let's move on a little bit here to pressure canning. So pressure canning is, I would say, an advanced preparation technique. Pressure canning relies on proper understanding of the process to achieve a safe result. So the pros, again, with pressure canning, shelf stable, easy to store, aesthetically pleasing, and they're not acidic. So this is the kind of thing where you can, dump a can of pressure canned corn, add a little bit of butter to it, and have a wonderful side to accompany your meal without having to, eat something that tastes, vinegary and pickled. However, the cons, and this is very real, it's dangerous if done incorrectly. It's a lot of work to process. This also creates a very hot and steamy kitchen, and this relies on approved and tested processes. I would also add that there is an equipment purchase required for this, and that is a pressure canner. And a pressure canner is different than a pressure cooker. So if you have an Instapot or something like that, those are not what the thermal validation folks are using to test this. They're using pressure canners, and they start at around $100. So, you know, it's a bit of an investment to get into pressure canning. You know, this is what you would see when you go to your local grocery store, when you see things like green beans and asparagus and corn and stuff like that on the shelf in a metal can. That is done in a retort in a commercial setting, and a retort is essentially a commercial pressure canner. So some of the key points around pressure canning, again, using approved and tested recipes. The only safeguard that you have against foodborne illness with pressure canning is time and temperature. Canning, again, creates an anaerobic environment, ideal for our friend Clostridium botulinum. However, this time, we don't have that pH of 4.6 or lower to inhibit the growth of CBOT spores. What we have to do instead is attain temperatures of 240 Fahrenheit or hotter, and we have to equilibrate throughout that food product that temperature of 240 Fahrenheit. Now, if you remember going back to science class in high school, water turns into steam at 212, right? That's where you see boiling. So the only way to achieve that temperature of 240 is to do it under pressure. And so I've referenced a pressure chart on the right here. And what you'll see is that at a pressure of 11 psi, you attain a temperature of 241.8 Fahrenheit. So that's the threshold for the destruction of Clostridium botulinum. And that's an incredibly important number to hit. If you don't achieve that temperature, you will run the risk of having CBOT spores survive and reproducing in the anaerobic environment that you've created for them with your pressure canned product. The basic process for pressure canning is, again, to prep fruit or veg by washing, peeling, and cutting. And I should also add in that meat is often pressure canned. You would sterilize your jars, place new lids in warm water. You would fill the jars with your product in liquid solution, taking special care to not dirty the seal and to mind your headspace. And then you would process it in your pressure canner according to a tested process. And again, the National Center for Food Preservation and many extension services around the country have resources for pressure canned products. I will share that right now I'm working on a grant-funded research endeavor with the Aquaculture Research Institute, and we're working with a very new aquaculture products called that's scallops that are raised in lantern nets. Typically, scallops are wild harvested and they swim around, and they have to be either dredged or caught with nets. But the scallops that we're working with are actually raised in farm settings, and it's a really interesting product. I won't go into too much detail, but the process for setting that up has required us to partner with Michigan State University to have a process authority that's been certified by the USDA, review our process, thermally process it using thermocouples that they've inserted into the cans with pressure medium so that they can maintain the pressure. And then they've processed it and given us back a procedure that works. So it's very serious business and takes quite a bit of education and equipment to validate recipes for pressure canning. So definitely trust your extension resources and folks like the University of Georgia at the National Center for Food Preservation for anything pressure canning. You know, I'm very weary of blogs and things like that. You know, a lot of these survivalists and prepper type folks really like pressure canning because it allows you to put up things like beef chili, and you can pressure can a chicken and broth and things like that. But you know, definitely make sure that you're minding your process and that you have a good understanding of what the process is asking you to do. I will share that the University of Maine Cooperative Extension did a webinar series recently where they have a 45-minute video on YouTube that you can watch of how to pressure can and the science and the method behind that. And I would definitely encourage you to do your homework before getting into pressure canning. some of the products that are ideal for pressure canning are things like corn, meats, beans. You can grow things like Marfax beans or soldier beans or things like that, and you can cook them, you can jar them, and you can pressure can them. You can also pressure can things like green beans. You'll see a lot of canned fish. So you might be a big fisherman here in Maine. Things like tuna are probably the most classic examples of pressure canned seafood. You'll also see recipes for beets, carrots, things like that. Don't let me totally talk you out of pressure canning, but please do respect that it is a potentially hazardous or dangerous process that requires some diligence on your part to really understand what's going into it. So moving on, dehydration. So dehydration, excuse me, is one of the oldest forms of food preservation known to man. It can be both one of the simplest, and it can also be aided by modern technology. But it's a great way to preserve food. And some of the pros to dehydration are, again, that it's shelf stable. So, it can be stored right at room temperature. It's very easy to store, very aesthetically pleasing to look at, easy to process. And from a food safety perspective, relatively safe. There's not much that can go terribly wrong with dehydration, other than maybe some molding or spoiling in that regard. So some of the cons with dehydration, some textural disappointment when things are reconstituted. Something that's been dehydrated and then been cooked to rehydrate, it doesn't have the same texture. The cells have lost their turgidity. So you're working with something that's mushier or softer and isn't going to have that same bite or texture that it did when it was fresh. So that can be a little bit of a disappointment for folks. Dehydration can be energy intensive. It can also be energy neutral, depending on what you're dehydrating and how you're doing it. But a lot of modern dehydrators rely on electricity. It's slow. Sometimes dehydration can take 24 hours or more of running that dehydrator. Sometimes you're using passive dehydration, and it can take days to fully dehydrate something. To kind of build on that slow bit, you typically have a fairly low volume or throughput in terms of the amount of product that you can dehydrate, unless you invest in a dehydration cabinet or something like that. Or maybe you have a greenhouse and you're using screens and dehydrating out there, but typically you're not able to dehydrate large volumes. But overall, I think the biggest con with dehydration is it's hard to judge the degree of desiccation. And what I mean by that is the amount of moisture that you've removed from the food product. It's always a little bit of a guessing game, unless you've bought a water activity meter or a drying oven and you're doing the methodology for your moisture content. But typically home folks are having a hard time with judging the degree of desiccation. And and there are a few key bits that you can look for, and I'll talk about that a little bit as we go into this. So some of the key points around dehydration. Your typical temperature, if you were to buy an inexpensive electric dehydrator, sometimes they just have a default temperature, and that's typically around 140 Fahrenheit. If you buy a nicer dehydrator, you might have the opportunity to set those temperatures yourself. And that can be from an ambient temperature of 75 up to temperatures of 160 or higher. The more heat you subject a food product to, the more you have nutrient degradation. And so, less heat is better. Your safeguard, what's keeping you safe, or what is making that food resist spoilage, is water activity. And so water activity is different from moisture content. Water activity is the amount of water that's available to spoilage bacteria and pathogens. And so some food products like a fruit leather or something like that might actually retain a fair amount of moisture, but it won't spoil because the natural sugars and things like that are tying up all of that available water, so that when the bacteria comes to hang out, there's nobody around to hang out with them. Some other food products, like say a dried chili pepper or a dried mushroom, they don't have sugars or other factors to tie up that available water, And so you are dehydrating them to the point of a very low water activity or moisture content. And what you're looking for there is a brittle texture. Often they're quite hard. They will crack or split when you touch them. Whereas something like a fruit leather or a dehydrated apple slice or something like that, they might still have some pliability to them or some chew to them. And that's because they still have some moisture content, but again, it's tied up so that it's not available for bacteria to use for spoilage. By far, your biggest risk for the loss of your food product is mold. Please don't think that you can rinse molds off or wipe them off and have it safe to eat. Molds reproduce via spores, and a lot of times the spores are where the toxins lie. So if you do have a moldy dehydrated product, likely you didn't get it dry enough, or you didn't store it in an environment with a low enough relative humidity, and moisture was able to get back to it and cause it to spoil. So oftentimes you'll see this when folks try to dry fresh herbs by hanging them around their kitchen. A couple months later, or maybe after they're done, water bath canning all of their tomatoes, those dried herbs are getting moist and getting dry and getting moist and getting dry, and then you go to pull them down to use them, and they've got a light coating of mold on them. I did notice recently that Ball and Mason have come out with some little silica packs that you can put into your dehydrated food products in the jar inside of like a little, it's like a little strainer that sits in the cap, and that little silica pack is a desiccant, and so it attracts the moisture from the food products, ties it up, and keeps that mold from happening. So if you've gone out like me and collected some amazing morel mushrooms from the mountains, and you definitely don't want them to get moldy and spoil, putting a desiccant inside the jar to tie up any available moisture from the environment might be something that's worth the minimal investment. Now, one note about dehydrating fruits: oftentimes fruits are given a pre-treatment before dehydration, and that pre-treatment is typically an antioxidant or a acidic treatment. So something like citric acid or ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C. You're soaking those vegetables in a solution, or you're dipping them into that acid treatment. And that is for two things. One, it's going to keep it fresher for longer. It's also going to prevent discoloration. Sometimes in grocery store apricots or things like that, you might see contains sodium bisulfate. Again, that sulfiting is just a way to prevent molding and oxidation. That's important even in home processed fruits as well, because nothing's worse than growing it, spending all the time to prep it, only to have to toss it out because you didn't pre-treat it. And citric acid, ascorbic acid, they're not scary things. They're just vitamin C. So don't think that you're taking your homegrown thing and adulterating it in some way. One note on vegetables: for some vegetables, you will want to blanch them prior to dehydrating them, and that blanching is important because it deactivates some enzymes, and those enzymes are designed by the vegetable to deteriorate it. So that blanching process will inactivate those enzymes, and it will also open up the cellular structure a little bit. So a lot of times when you blanch and shock something, you'll see that it becomes a lot brighter in color, and that's because of the increased air within the cells and the way that it reflects light. But the real key is to prevent that enzymatic degradation. And so anyways, one of the really cool things about dehydration is the exciting world of homegrown spices and herbs. Some of the things that work really well for dehydration are things like mushrooms. In your garden, you might be growing dill, coriander, cumin, oregano, parsley. Onion and garlic is also a cool one. Pretty much any fruit can become a fruit leather. Flowers are wonderful. A way to talk about passive dehydration would be growing something like a shelling bean, growing your own kidney or pintos or black turtle beans, things like that kind of exciting because you can hang them to dry in a drafty space like a garage or maybe a greenhouse or a barn, and then you can package and store those to enjoy later as well. One more item to talk about with dehydration is freeze drying. Freeze drying is very cool. I would encourage you to check out Harvest Right. They are home freeze dryers. Freeze drying is the ultimate way to do dehydration, but we could talk too long about that, so I'll just leave it at that. If you're inspired to look at freeze drying, definitely Google that. Freezing is an outstanding way to put up food. It's easy to store, easy to process, it's very safe. You have excellent quality when thawed. You have 100% nutrients retained, right? Because you're not thermally processing this in any way. However, the cons is energy intensive and dependent. You have some space constraints, and you have a lot of use of plastic, which I know everybody's trying to limit their plastic use these days. But unfortunately, as I talk about in some of the key points, there's really no alternative to using some plastic for quality freezing. So first and foremost, when freezing, you need to label and keep things organized in your freezer. If you have things labeled, it allows you to practice a food safety standard here, which is called FIFO, or first in, first out. And what that means is to rotate your food products. Eat the oldest stuff first. Don't just jam the new stuff in on top of the old stuff and then eat the new stuff and have the old stuff stay in there perpetually. That's very important. Temperature is what is slowing or retarding bacterial growth or spoilage. So a consistent temperature around 0 Fahrenheit is ideal. Your best quality is going to be by vacuum sealing. Vacuum sealing is going to remove air from the package, and it's going to give you the best quality over the long term. It's not uncommon to have storage lives of 1 year to 2 years for frozen food items. And freezer burn is relatively easy to avoid these days with quality packaging. When things were wrapped in paper and frozen, a lot of freezer burn. When you have a lot of air inside the package, a lot of freezer burn. But if you pack things tightly and use good quality freezer specific packaging, you won't get much freezer burn. And I'd say really the biggest downfall to freezing is that it was reliant on electricity. And so if you have a power outage or something like that, you might be sweating bullets thinking about your freezer full of your home raised chicken or something, where all those preppers who pressure canned theirs are sitting back and not worried one bit. So either way, basic process again: prep fruit or veg by washing, peeling, and cutting. Blanch and shock the vegetables to prevent that enzymatic deterioration. Package tightly to limit air. And quick freezing is going to yield the best quality. A slow freeze creates crystals within the cells of the product that's freezing. When you thaw it back out, those cells have been burst by those crystals, and you end up with damaged cellular structure on the outside of meats. And so sometimes you have discoloration, you have tough parts, things like that. A quick freeze is the best. So typically you want to lay things out on trays, freeze them flat, and then when you put them into your freezer, similar to this picture, you can line them all up nice and neat, and they take up a lot less space when they've been frozen nice and flat. Plus they freeze faster when frozen flat as well. Fermenting. So fermenting is an amazing way to preserve food and is a very exciting world to learn about. So some of the pros are very unique flavors, increased nutrition. Fermented foods sustained people in history. There are, folks wouldn't have survived in Eastern Europe without sauerkraut and things like that through the winters to provide them the vitamins that they needed to meet their nutritional needs. Fermenting requires no energy. It doesn't have to require any plastic. The cons are spoilage and mold that, sometimes it gets you despite your best efforts. And it's so frustrating to have to toss out a moldy ferment, but sometimes it happens. I will say that some folks are averse to the sour flavors. And you do require the use of airlocks a lot of times, which can be a little bit tricky for some people to source and utilize. Some of the key points: sanitation is so important. You need to properly wash and clean your vessels, your prep surfaces, your hands. You need to use salt without additives. A lot of salt have flowing agents in them, things like prussiates and things like that keep it from clumping. You want to use sea salts or pickling salts that don't have additives. Cabbage is your most common example, whether it be sauerkrauts or kimchis. And that's because cabbage is covered in lactobacilli. Those lactobacilli produce lactic acid. That acidic pH is the key to preventing that spoilage, just like in the pickling, where you're relying on acetic acid or vinegar. Here you're relying on natural production of lactic acid. Now, one very important note that's hard learned by a lot of people, you've got to keep it submerged beneath that brine solution, which is the acidic salt brine that's produced by the cabbage. You got to keep it submerged. I think that a unique thing to note about fermenting is it's historically and culturally very important to a lot of people throughout the world, and I think that that's something neat to tap into when you're fermenting and when you're learning about fermenting. But again, the process is relatively similar, where you're prepping vegetables by washing, peeling, cutting, and salting. You're packing them into a fermentation vessel. You're allowing them to ferment at room temp until sufficiently sour. And then a lot of times you can refrigerate to slow that fermentation. Some of the fermented foods that we're all familiar with are things like cabbages. There's an exciting world of cabbages and cabbage ferments out there. Root vegetables also ferment fairly well. Some of the other vegetables that are in the cabbage family, like Brussels sprouts, ferment fairly well. Winter squashes can ferment. And one of the things that people are very familiar with, but maybe don't realize is oftentimes a fermented product, are hot sauces. Taking chili peppers and salt, making what's called a mash, allowing that to ferment sometimes for several years before straining, and then using that acidic, peppery, spicy sauce to top foods and to add that bit of acidity to brighten flavors. And then, of course, cucumbers, your sour cucumbers or your half sours, those are a fermented product as well. And then cellaring is the last one that I'll talk about here. And I'll say that it's honestly my favorite. It's the easiest of all the preservation methods. There's no equipment required. However, it does require some diligence. You've got to go and check your cellared items. The old adage that one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch, that comes from cellaring. If you go down and you've got apples in your cellar and you got a bad apple in the bunch, all the apples around that bad one will be rotten too. So sanitation is important. Sanitizing your storage surfaces, your trays, your shelves, things like that. Ensuring that your produce that's going in is clean. There is some important preparation to putting things into a cellar. There's typically a curing stage in the picture there on the right. As an onion harvest from last year, curing in a dry, drafty space, allowing the greens to fully die back, and then you get a better seal on that onion. And I was eating onions from last year right through to my onions coming out of the garden this year. So it's not uncommon to have things like cabbages that are stored in a cellar setting last 6 months. Things like root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, garlic, beets can last a year as well. Vegetables and fruits, some of them have a natural resistance to spoilage. Onions, where it's a bulb, that is a biennial crop. It does not want to rot. It wants to maintain its energy so that the following year it can send up a flower and go to seed and produce more onions. So several crops are like that. Cabbage is a biennial as well. So any of those biennial crops typically are very well suited to cellaring. And gosh, it doesn't get easier than that. The one thing that's important is to prep them properly. Don't try to cellar damaged or diseased vegetables along with your healthy ones. And you want to understand the storage zones throughout your house or where you live, different things like different relative humidities and temperatures. So much to my wife's chagrin, I've got vegetables all over our house, from our loft to our basement to our pantry. We're swimming in vegetables, but hey, it's nice to see all that food around. So with that, I'll go to my resources page, and I just listed a few resources, notably UMaine Cooperative Extension, a few different books down here. If you're inspired by fermentation, definitely check out Sandor Katz and The Art of Fermentation and Wild Fermentation. Doesn't get better than that. And Ball is a wonderful resource for preserving. So with that, I will stop my screen share. And Sam, I hope I left enough time for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Rob. That was really thorough. I've definitely been thinking about starting fermenting, and now I have no excuse. Just so everyone knows, all of the resources that Rob listed at the end of his presentation will be available in the follow-up email, so don't worry about scribbling them down really fast. Just to start us off, we had a question in the chat about extension services testing pressure canner gauges. I dropped a link in the chat for that testing service. They still do it. It's very useful, especially if you have an old pressure canner or one that maybe you picked up from the thrift store that you're not sure if it works. That's essential to making sure you are pressure canning safely. Yes. So Rob, one question that we had come up in the chat from Claire was that she's previously sterilized jars in the oven before. Is that a safe method if you're using them for canning, or should they be water bath sterilized?
I would say the best answer is to follow the process outlined in the approved recipe that you're using. However, from a gut feeling perspective, yeah, you're probably fine, assuming that the jars are staying in there long enough to get hot enough. But again, air does not conduct heat energy quite like water does, right? One of the ways to think about that is that you can reach into a 450-degree oven with a hot pad and grab a sheet pan out and set it on your counter and your arm doesn't burn up. But if you reached into a steamer with a hot pad to try to grab, some lobsters that were steaming, the steam that's only 212 degrees coming out of that steamer would burn you terribly. So, that's one of the ways to think about that heat energy transfer. And just, I would follow the recipe would be the best advice there.
Awesome. Hope that was helpful, Claire. So just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, drop them in the chat, but I'm going to answer a few that we have received via email. That is to say, I will ask a few to Rob and he will answer them. So what essential kitchen tools do you recommend for people to have if they're looking to make the most of their summer harvest? Are there any absolute musts?
Yeah, I think, and this is maybe a no-brainer, but a really good knife, and cutting board is a key piece of kitchen equipment that makes processing fruits and vegetables much safer, much more pleasurable. Working with dull or cheap equipment can be dangerous and can cause some ergonomic discomfort as well. In addition to that, I think that you want to kind of gear yourselves towards the preservation discipline that you're most interested in. So, if dehydration is the direction you really want to go, looking at a variety of different dehydration methods, such as, purchasing an electric dehydrator, purchasing some screens or things like that. If you want to try passive dehydration, fermentation can be very simple. A lot of times folks do it in mason jars with fermentation interlocks. So that can be something that's relatively inexpensive to get into. Whereas the things like pressure canning or water bath canning, certainly a little bit more expensive. And of course, if you're going to focus on things like cellaring, that's you have to have a house, but as long as you have somewhere to live, you don't need any specialized equipment.
I will say that I wrote an article about DIY alternatives to root cellaring, some sort of, ad hoc Rubbermaid totes buried in the ground kind of thing that I will link to in the follow-up email. So if you don't have a huge root cellar in your house, maybe there is still hope for your root cellar.
Yeah, but you could store things like onions, under the bed in your guest room. You could store things like, garlic in your attic. There are vegetables that you can store in different places throughout your house where you don't, not everything likes the humidity and cool, dark temperatures of a root cellar. So in some cases that will cause things to try to sprout. So you might want to avoid that depending on what you're storing.
Good to know. My guests will love that, onions under their bed. So I think everyone here who's gardened before knows that there are some crops that just every summer seem to blow up like crazy and you have way too many. And one that always comes up is zucchini. Yeah. What do you recommend doing with all that zucchini, Rob?
Yeah. I think there's the old adage that you gotta, lock your car doors when you go to church, and you gotta, lock your windows and your house when you leave, because your neighbors will try to drop off zucchini for you. It's no joke. Zucchini can be incredibly productive sometimes, and it's both a blessing and a challenge. So some of the ways that I have seen people creatively use zucchini is things like making a zucchini relish or a zucchini pickle. Some folks have actually gotten to where they prefer using a zucchini pickle on their summer hamburgers or a zucchini relish on their hot dogs or sausages. And that's a very creative way to use it, and certainly extends the period of time that you can eat that. I've also seen some interesting recipes recently for using zucchini similar to how you would an apple filling, and making things like a zucchini pie or a zucchini crisp, where you're chopping it up, you're cooking it in sugar and warm spices, and then topping it with pastry or streusel, and you've got a unique and creative way to eat zucchini in that regard. I would also say that zucchini dehydrates and reconstitutes fairly well for things like soups and stews or pasta sauces. So dehydrated zucchini is an option, though, one big zucchini can sometimes fill up a whole dehydrator. So, it can be a little bit tricky to process a lot that way. Yeah.
Good to know. Those are good tips. Another question that comes up often is, what are some things and elements of your summer harvest that you would normally ignore or throw away that can be useful in the kitchen? Not so much things that you would preserve for later, but things that you can use right away instead of composting them or throwing them away.
Sure. I think, some of the vegetables that, you often are discarding an edible portion would be things like beets. A lot of folks don't eat their beet greens. Beet greens, even on a fully mature beet, are still edible, and they can be preserved in some very easy ways. They can be blanched, shocked. You can squeeze the excess moisture out of them, and then they can be added into smoothies. They can be added into a braised green like a kale or a mustard green to accompany as a side dish as part of a menu. You can also use cooked blanched greens like that, topped with breadcrumbs and cheese for something like a gratin, and that could be very good. Think like a spinach casserole kind of thing, or a spinach and artichoke dip. Any hearty green could be used in place of that spinach for a yummy cheesy dip like that. Carrots are another one. Carrot greens are edible. You'll see a lot of recipes for folks doing things like pestos using carrot greens, which can be quite useful. And then lastly, I would say that tomato skins are something that are often discarded in the sauce making process, where people will, if you want to make good quality tomato sauce, I recommend you peel your tomatoes. The tomato skins don't break down during the cooking process, and they will remain stringy in your finished sauce. So if you do what's called concasse, where you cut a little X into your tomato, briefly boil it, shock it in ice water. When you peel it, you end up with quite a volume of peeled tomato skins. Those can be passively dehydrated. And by that, I mean you can lay them out on screens, dehydrate them in a drafty, warm, dry place. And then those skins can be ground up in a spice grinder, and you end up with this amazing tomato powder that adds another dimension of flavor and depth to tomato products. So kind of a fun one there that I really like.
That's a good hack. I'm definitely going to try that.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time. So if anyone has any last minute questions, pop them in the chat real quick. But one of the things that I'm thinking about now as the season is coming to a close, and obviously I'm thinking about my garden next year already. So what are some of the crops that are easiest to grow and store in Maine that you think people need to be growing more of?
I think that onions are one of the easiest things to grow, and they are one of the most rewarding things in that they go in almost everything that you cook. And there's really an exciting world of onions out there. If you go on to one of our local seed companies like Johnny's or Fedco or Pine Tree Seeds, you'll see there's an exciting world of onions. Shallots are also have an interesting connection to Maine's Acadian history. So definitely shallots are another one that are well worth growing. Winter squashes. Wow, you want to talk about an amazing diversity and variety of foods. Winter squashes are very forgiving to grow. They do take up a ton of space, but they are easy to store and easy to cook. And then potatoes, Maine's a wonderful soil and climate for growing potatoes. If you can beat those darn Colorado potato beetles, you got to be a diligent squisher. But if you can keep those guys under control, you can really grow some amazing potatoes that are easy to store and easy to eat. And then lastly, garlic. What's better than good homegrown garlic? I can't think of anything. And it's pretty much a hands-off crop. And you get 2 harvests. You get your scapes and you get your bulbs. So that's a great one to grow.
And just so everyone knows, garlic planting season is coming up. You want to plant it in the fall so it can overwinter and develop cloves. Before we leave, Rob, Susan wants to know, are there any fermentation videos you can recommend, either through the cooperative extension or maybe a YouTuber that you like that you think is credible?
Yeah, I think if you go to the University of Maine Cooperative Extension website and you look for the link for their Preserving the Harvest video series, you'll find one on making sauerkraut. And one of our extension educators, Kate McCarty, down in the Falmouth office, does a live demonstration of how to make sauerkraut. And that's a great starting point. And then I would definitely recommend checking out either The Art of Fermentation or Wild Fermentation by Sandor Katz. He will have you inspired to ferment everything.
And I will drop the link to that video with Kate in the chat. Kate also helped me learn how to water bath can, and she's fantastic.
Yeah.
So highly recommend.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it's 7:02, folks. So that's just about all the time Rob and I have with you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate all of your attendance and your thoughtful questions. Rob, thank you so much for your presentation. I hope you all feel inspired to make the most of your summer harvest this year.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam.